Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here to continue reading The Reptile Room, the second book in a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket, illustrated by Brett Helquist, and published by Harper Collins Publishing. We're going to pick up right where we left off, which is right after Sunny, the baby sister of the three Baudelaires, was bitten by the incredibly deadly viper. Chapter 3. You can see the picture. I'm very, very sorry to leave you hanging like that, but as I was writing the tale of the Baudelaire orphans, I happened to look at the time and realized that I was running late for a formal dinner party given by a friend of mine, Madame de Lestro. Madame de Lestro is a good friend, an excellent detective, and a fine cook, but she flies into a rage if you arrive even 5 minutes later than her invitation states. You must have thought at the end of the previous chapter that Sunny was dead and that this was the terrible thing that happened to the Baudelaires at Uncle Monty's house, but I promise you Sunny survives this particular episode. It is Uncle Monty, unfortunately, who will be dead, but not yet. As the fangs of the incredibly deadly viper closed on Sunny's chin, Violet and Klaus watched in horror as little Sunny's eyes closed and her face grew quiet. Then, moving as suddenly as the snake, Sunny smiled brightly, opened her mouth, and bit the incredible deadly viper right on its tiny, scaly nose. The snake let go of her chin, and Violet and Klaus could see that it had barely left a mark. The two older Baudelaire siblings looked at Uncle Monty, and Uncle Monty looked at them and laughed. His loud laughter bounced off the glass walls of the reptile room. "Uncle Monty, what can we do?" Klaus said in despair. "Oh, I'm sorry, my dears," Uncle Monty said, wiping his eyes with his hands. "You must be very frightened, but the incredible deadly viper is one of the least dangerous and most friendly creatures in the animal kingdom. Sunny has nothing to worry about, and neither do you." Klaus looked at his baby sister, who was still in his arms as she playfully gave the incredible deadly viper a big hug around its thick body, and he realized that Uncle Monty must be telling the truth. "But then why is it called the incredibly deadly viper?" Uncle Monty laughed again. "It's a misnomer," he said, using a word which here means a very wrong name. "Because I discovered it, I got to name it, remember? Don't tell anyone about the incredible deadly viper, because I'm going to present it at the Herpetological Society and give them a good scare before explaining that the snake is completely harmless. Lord knows they've teased me many times because of my name. Hello, hello, Montgomery, Montgomery, they say. How are you, Montgomery, Montgomery? But at this year's conference, I'm going to get back at them with this prank." Uncle Monty drew himself up to his full height and began talking in a silly scientific voice. "Colleagues, I'll say, I would like to introduce you to a new species, the incredible deadly viper, which I found in the southwest forest of... Oh my God, it's escaped!" And then, when all my fellow herpetologists have jumped up on chairs and tables and are shrieking in fear, I'll tell them that the snake wouldn't hurt a fly. Won't that be hysterical? Violet and Klaus looked at each other and then began laughing, half in relief that their sister was unharmed and half in amusement, because they thought that Uncle Monty's prank was a good one. Klaus put Sunny down on the floor, and the incredible deadly viper followed, wriggling its tail affectionately around Sunny the way that you might put your arm around someone of whom you are very fond. "Are there any snakes in this room that are dangerous?" Violet asked. "Of course," Uncle Monty said. "You can't study snakes for 40 years without encountering some dangerous ones. I have a whole cabinet full of venom samples from every poisonous snake known to people so that I can study the ways in which these dangerous snakes work. There is a snake in this room whose venom is so deadly that your heart would stop before you even knew that he'd bitten you. There is a snake who can open her mouth so wide that she could swallow all of us together in one gulp. And there is a pair of snakes who have learned to drive a car so recklessly that they would run you over in the street and never stop to apologize. But all of these snakes are in cages with much sturdier locks, and all of them can be handled safely when one has studied them enough. I promise that if you take the time to learn the facts, no harm will come to you here in the reptile room. There is a type of situation which occurs all too often and which is occurring at this point in the story of the Baudelaire orphans, called dramatic irony. Simply put, dramatic irony is when a person makes a harmless remark and someone else who hears it knows something that makes the remark of a different and unusually unpleasant meaning. For instance, if you were in a restaurant and said out loud, "I can't wait to eat the veal marsala I ordered," and there were people around you that knew the veal marsala was poisoned and you would die as soon as you took a bite, the situation would be one of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is a cruel occurrence, one that is almost always upsetting, and I'm sorry to have it appear in this story. But Violet, Klaus, and Sunny have such unfortunate lives that it was only a matter of time before dramatic irony reared its head. As you and I listen to Uncle Monty tell the three Baudelaire orphans that no harm will ever come to them in the Reptile Room, we should be experiencing the strange feeling that accompanies the arrival of dramatic irony. This feeling is not unlike the sinking in one's stomach when one is in an elevator that suddenly goes down, or when you are snug in bed and your closet door suddenly creaks open to reveal a person who has been hiding there. For no matter how safe and happy these three children felt, no matter how comforting Uncle Monty's words were, you and I know that soon Uncle Monty will be dead and the Baudelaires will be miserable once again. During the week that followed, however, the Baudelaires had a wonderful time in their new home. Each morning they woke and dressed in the privacy of their very own rooms, which they had chosen and decorated to their liking. Violet had chosen a room that had an enormous window looking into the snake-shaped hedges on the front lawn. She thought that such a view might inspire her when she was inventing things. Uncle Monty had allowed her to tack up large pieces of white paper on each wall so she could sketch out her ideas even if they came to her in the middle of the night. Klaus had chosen a room with a cozy alcove in it. The word alcove here means a very, very small nook, just perfect for sitting and reading. With Uncle Monty's permission, he had carried a large cushioned chair up from the living room and placed it right in the alcove under a heavy brass reading lamp. Each night, rather than read in bed, he would curl himself in the chair with a book from Uncle Monty's library, sometimes until morning. Sunny had chosen a room right between Violet and Klaus's and filled it with small, hard objects from all over the house so that she could bite them when she felt like it. There was also assorted toys for the incredible deadly viper so the two of them could play together whenever they wanted, within reason. But where the Baudelaire orphans most liked to be was the Reptile Room. Each morning after breakfast, they would join Uncle Monty, who would have already started to work on the upcoming expedition. Violet sat at a table with ropes, gears, and cages that made up different snake traps, learning how they worked, repairing them if they were broken, and occasionally making improvements to make the traps more comfortable for the snakes on their long journey from Peru to Uncle Monty's house. Klaus sat nearby reading books on Peru that Uncle Monty had and taking notes on a pad of paper so that they could refer to them later, and Sunny sat on the floor biting a long rope into shorter pieces with great enthusiasm. But what the Baudelaire youngsters liked best was learning all about the reptiles from Uncle Monty. As they worked, he would show them the Alaskan cow lizard, a long green creature that produced a delicious milk. They met the dissonant toad, which could imitate human speech in a gravelly voice. Uncle Monty taught them how to handle the inky newt without getting its black dye all over their fingers, and how to tell when the irascible python was grumpy and best left alone. He taught them not to give the green gimlet toad too much water, and to never, under any circumstances, let the Virginian wolf snake near a typewriter. When he was telling them about the different reptiles, Uncle Monty would often segue, a word which here means let the conversation veer off, to stories from his travel, describing the men, snakes, women, toad, children, and lizards he met on his journey. And before too long, the Baudelaire orphans were telling Uncle Monty all about their lives, eventually talking about their parents and how much they missed them. Uncle Monty was as interested in the Baudelaire story as they were in his, and sometimes they got talking so long they scarcely had time to gobble down dinner before cramming themselves into Uncle Monty's tiny jeep and heading to the movies. One morning, however, when the children finished their breakfast and went to the Reptile Room, they found not Uncle Monty, but a note from him. The note read as follows: Dear Bambini, I have gone into town to buy the last few things that we need for the expedition: Peruvian wasp repellent, toothbrushes, canned peaches, and a fireproof canoe. It will take me a while to find the peaches, so don't expect me back until dinner time. Stefano, Gustav's replacement, will arrive today by taxi. Please make him feel welcome. As you know, it is only 2 days into the expedition, so please work very hard today. Your giddy uncle, Monty. What does giddy mean? Violet asked when they had finished reading the note. Dizzy and excited, Klaus said, having learned the word from a collection of poetry that he'd read in first grade. I guess he means he's excited about Peru. Or maybe he's excited about having a new assistant. Or maybe he's excited about us, Violet said. Kinder! Sunny shrieked, which probably meant, or maybe he's excited about all three of these things. I'm a little giddy myself, Klaus said. It's really fun to live with Uncle Monty. It certainly is, Violet agreed. After the fire, I thought that I would never be happy again, but our time here has been wonderful. I still miss our parents, though, Klaus said. No matter how nice Uncle Monty is, I wish that we still lived in our real home. Of course, Violet said quickly. She paused and slowly said something out loud that she had been thinking for the past few days. I think we will always miss our parents. But I think we can miss them without being miserable all the time. After all, they wouldn't want us to be miserable. Remember that time, Klaus said wistfully, when we were bored one rainy afternoon and all of us painted our toenails bright red? Yes, Violet said, grinning, and I spilled some on the yellow chair. Achoo! Sunny said quietly, which probably meant something like, and the stain really never came out. The bottler orphans smiled at each other and without a word began to do the day's work. For the rest of the morning, they worked quietly and steadily, realizing that their contentment here at Uncle Monty's house did not erase their parents' death. Not at all, but at least it made them feel better after feeling so sad for so long. It is unfortunate, of course, that this quiet, happy moment is the last one that the children would have for quite some time, but there is nothing that anyone can do about it now. Just when the Baudelaires were beginning to think about lunch, they heard a car pull up in front of the house and toot its horn. To the children, it signaled the arrival of Stefano. To us, it should signal the beginning of more misery. I expect that's a new assistant, Klaus said, looking up from the big Peruvian book of small Peruvian snakes. I hope he's as nice as Monty. Me too, said Violet, opening and shutting a toad trap to make sure it worked smoothly. It would be unpleasant to travel to Peru with someone who was boring or mean. Gerja! Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, well, let's go find out what Stefano is like. The Baudelaires left the reptile room and walked to the front door to find a taxi parked next to the snake-shaped hedges. A very tall, thin man with a long beard and no eyebrows over his eyes was getting out of the back seat carrying a black suitcase with a shiny silver padlock. I'm not going to give you a tip, the bearded man was saying to the driver of the taxi, because you talk too much. Not everybody wants to hear about your new baby, you know. Oh, hello there. I'm Stefano, Dr. Montgomery's new assistant. How do you do? How do you do? Violet said, and as she approached him, there was something familiar about his wheezy voice. How do you do? Klaus said, and as he looked up at Stefano, there was something about his shiny eyes that seemed quite familiar. Huda! Sunny shrieked. Stefano was not wearing any socks, and Sunny, crawling on the ground, could see his bare ankle between his pant cuff and his shoe. There on his ankle was something that was most familiar of all. The Baudelaire orphans all realized at the same time and took a step back, as you might from a growling dog. This man was not Stefano, no matter what he called himself. The three children looked at Uncle Monty's new assistant from head to toe and saw that he was none other than Count Olaf. He may have shaved off his one long eyebrow and grown a beard over his scraggly chin, but there was no way that he could hide the tattoo of an eye on his ankle. Chapter 4. One of the most difficult things to think about in life is one's regrets. Sometimes something will happen to you and you will do the wrong thing, and for years afterwards, you will wish that you have done something different. For instance, sometimes when I am walking on the seashore or visiting the grave of a friend, I remember a day a long time ago when I didn't bring a flashlight with me to a place where I should have brought a flashlight, and the results were disastrous. Why didn't I bring a flashlight? I think to myself, even though it's too late to do anything about it, I should have brought a flashlight. For years after this moment in the lives of the Baudelaire orphans, Klaus thought of the time when he and his siblings realized that Stefano was actually Count Olaf and was filled with regret that he didn't call out to the driver of the taxi cab, who was beginning to drive back down the driveway. Stop, Klaus would think to himself, even though it was too late to do anything about it. Stop, take this man away. Of course, it is perfectly understandable that Klaus and his sisters were too surprised to act so quickly. But Klaus would lie awake in bed years later, thinking that maybe, just maybe, if he had acted in time, he could have saved Uncle Monty's life. But he didn't. As the Baudelaire orphans stared at Count Olaf, the taxi drove back down the driveway, and the children were alone with their nemesis, a word which here means the worst enemy that you could imagine. Olaf smiled at them the way that Uncle Monty's Mongolian mean snake would smile when a white mouse was placed in its cage each day for dinner. "Perhaps one of you might carry my suitcase to my room," he suggested in his wheezy voice. "The ride along that smelly road was dull and unpleasant, and I am tired." "If anyone ever deserved to travel along Lousy Lane," Violet said, glaring at him, "it is you, Count Olaf. We will certainly not help you with your luggage because we will not let you in this house." Olaf frowned at the orphans and then looked this way and that as if he expected to see someone hiding behind the snake-shaped hedges. "Who is Count Olaf?" he said quizzically. "My name is Stefano. I'm here to assist Montgomery with his upcoming expedition to Peru. I assume you three are the midgets who are working as servants in the Montgomery home." "We are not midgets," Klaus said sternly. "We're children. And you are not Stefano. You are Count Olaf. You may have grown a beard and shaved your eyebrow, but you are not the same. You are still the same despicable person, and we will not let you in this house." Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "I agree." Count Olaf looked at each of the Baudelaire orphans, his eyes shining brightly, as if he was telling a joke. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, "but if I did, if I were this Count Olaf you speak of, I would think that you were being very rude. And if I thought you were being rude, I might get angry. And if I got angry, who knows what I would do?" The children watched as Count Olaf raised his scrawny arms and sort of shrugged. It probably isn't necessary to remind you just how violent he could be, but it certainly wasn't necessary at all to remind the Baudelaires. Klaus could still feel the bruise on his face from the time that Count Olaf had struck him when they were living in his house. Sunny still ached from being stuffed into a bird cage and dangled from the tower where he made his evil plans, and while Violet had not been the victim of any physical violence from this terrible man, she had almost been forced to marry him, and that was enough to make her pick up his suitcase and drag it slowly towards the door. "Higher," said Olaf. "Lift it higher. I don't want it dragged along the ground like that." Klaus and Sunny hurried to help Violet with the suitcase, but even with the three of them, carrying the weight made them stagger. It was misery enough that Count Olaf had reappeared in their lives just when they were feeling so comfortable and safe with Uncle Monty. But to actually be helping this awful person enter their home was almost more than they could bear. Olaf followed closely behind them, and the three children could smell his stale breath as they brought the suitcase indoor and set it on the carpet beneath the painting of the entwined snakes. "Thank you, orphans," Olaf said, shutting the front door behind him. "Now, Dr. Montgomery said my room would be waiting upstairs. Suppose I can carry my luggage from here. Now run along. We'll have lots of time to get to know each other later." "We already know you, Count Olaf," Violet said. "You obviously haven't changed a bit." "You haven't changed either," Olaf said. "It is clear to me, Violet, that you are as stubborn as ever. And Klaus, you are still wearing those idiotic glasses from reading too many books. And I see that little Sunny here still has 9 toes instead of 10. "Foot!" Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "I do not." "What are you talking about?" Klaus said impatiently. "She has 10 toes. "Really?" Olaf said. "That's odd. I remember that she lost one of her toes in an accident." His eyes shone even brighter, as if he were telling a joke, and he reached into the pocket of his shabby coat and brought out a long knife, such as one might use for slicing bread. "I seem to recall there was a man who was so confused by being called repeatedly by the wrong name that he accidentally dropped a knife on her little foot and severed one of her toes." Violet and Klaus looked at Count Olaf and then at the bare foot of their little sister. "You wouldn't dare," Klaus said. "Let's not discuss what I wouldn't or wouldn't dare to do," Olaf said. "Let's discuss, rather, what I am going to be called for as long as we are together in this house." "We'll call you Stefano if you insist on threatening us," Violet said. "But we won't be together in this house for long." Stefano opened his mouth to say something, but Violet was not interested in continuing the conversation. She turned on her heel and marched primly through the enormous door of the reptile room, followed by her siblings. If you or I would have been there, we would have thought that the Baudelaire orphans weren't scared at all, speaking so bravely like that to Stefano, and then simply walking away. But once the children reached the far end of the room, their true emotions showed clearly on their faces. The Baudelaires were terrified. Violet put her hands over her face and leaned against one of the reptile cages. Klaus sunk into a chair, trembling so hard that his feet rattled against the marble floor. And Sunny curled up into a little ball on the floor, so tiny that you might have missed her if you walked into the room. For several minutes, none of the children spoke, Just listen to the muffled sounds of Stefano walking up the stairs and their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. How did he find us? Klaus said. His voice was a hoarse whisper, as if he had a sore throat. How did he get to be Uncle Monty's assistant? What is he doing here? He vowed that he'd get his hands on the bottle of their fortune, Violet said, taking her hands away from her face and picking up Sunny, who was shivering. That was the last thing he said to me before he escaped. He said he'd get our fortune, if it was the last thing he ever did. Violet shuddered and did not add that he'd also said that once he got their fortune, he'd do away with all 3 of the Baudelaire siblings. She did not need to add that. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny all knew that if he figured out a way to seize their fortune, he would slit the throats of the Baudelaire orphans as easily as you or I might eat a small butter cookie. What can we do? Klaus said. Uncle Monty won't be back for hours. Maybe we can call Mr. Poe, Violet said. It's the middle of business hours, but maybe he could leave the bank for an emergency. He wouldn't believe us, Klaus said. Remember when we tried to tell him about Count Olaf when we lived there? He took such a long time to realize the truth, it was almost too late. I think we should run away. If we leave right now, we could probably get to town and attempt to get a train far away from here. Violet pictured the 3 of them, all alone, walking along Lousy Lane beneath the sour apple trees with the bitter smell of horseradish encircling them. Where would we go? She asked. Anywhere, Klaus said. Anywhere but here. We could go far away where Count Olaf wouldn't find us and change our names so that no one would know who we are. We haven't any money, Violet pointed out. How would we live by ourselves? We could get jobs, Klaus replied. I could work in a library maybe, and you could work in some sort of mechanical factory. Sunny probably couldn't get a job at her age, but in a few years she could. The 3 orphans were quiet. They tried to picture leaving Uncle Monty and living by themselves, trying to find jobs and taking care of each other. It was a very lonely prospect. The Baudelaire children sat in silence a while, and they were each thinking the same thing. They wished their parents had never been killed by the fire, that their lives had never been turned topsy-turvy the way they had. If only the Baudelaire parents were still alive, the youngsters wouldn't even have heard of Count Olaf, let alone have him settling into their home and undoubtedly making evil plans. We can't leave, Violet said finally. Count Olaf found us once, and I'm sure he'd find us again, no matter how far we went. Plus, who knows where Count Olaf's assistants are? Perhaps they've surrounded the house right now, keeping watch in case we're on to him. Klaus shivered. He hadn't been thinking of Olaf's assistants. Besides scheming to get his hands on the Baudelaire fortune, Olaf was the leader of a terrible theater troupe, and his fellow actors were always ready to help him with his plans. They were a gruesome crew, each more terrifying than the next. There was a bald man with a long nose who always wore a black robe. There were 2 women who always had ghostly white powder on their faces. There was a person so large and blank-looking that you couldn't really tell if it was a man or a woman. And there was a skinny man with 2 hooks where his hands should have been. Violet was right. Any of these people could be lurking outside Uncle Monty's house, waiting to catch them if they tried to escape. I think we should just wait for Uncle Monty to come back and tell him what's happened, Violet said. He'll believe us. If we tell him about the tattoo, he'll at least ask Stefano for an explanation. Violet's tone of voice when she said Stefano indicated her utter scorn for Count Olaf's disguise. Are you sure? Klaus said. After all, Uncle Monty is the one who hired Stefano. Klaus's tone of voice when he said Stefano indicated that he shared his sister's feelings. For all we know, Uncle Monty and Stefano have planned something together. Minda! Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, Don't be ridiculous, Klaus. Violet shook her head. Sunny is right. I can't believe that Uncle Monty would be in cahoots with Olaf. He has been so kind and generous to us. And besides, if they were working together, Olaf would insist on using a different name. That's true, Klaus said thoughtfully. So we wait for Uncle Monty. We wait, Violet agreed. Toujours, Sunny said solemnly, and the siblings looked at one another gloomily. Waiting is one of life's hardships. It is hard enough to wait for chocolate cream pie while burnt roast beef is still on your plate. It is plenty difficult to wait for Halloween when the tedious month of September is still ahead of you, but to wait for one's adopted uncle to come home while a greedy and violent man is upstairs was one of the worst waits that the Baudelaires had ever experienced. To get their mind off it, they tried to continue their work, but the children were too anxious to get anything done. Violet tried to fix a hinged door on one of the traps, but all she could concentrate on was the knot of worry in her stomach. Klaus tried to read about protecting oneself from thorny Peruvian plants, but thoughts of Stefano kept clouding his brain. And Sunny tried to bite rope, but she had a cold chill of fear running through her teeth, and she soon gave up. She didn't even feel like playing with the incredible deadly viper. So the Baudelaires spent the rest of the afternoon sitting silently in the reptile room, looking out the window for Uncle Monty's Jeep and listening to the occasional noise from upstairs. They didn't even want to think about what Stefano might be unpacking. Finally, as the snake-shaped hedges began to cast long, skinny shadows in the setting sun, the three children heard the approaching engine, and the Jeep pulled up. A large canoe was strapped to the roof of the Jeep, and the back seat was piled with Monty's purchases. Uncle Monty got out, struggling under the weight of several shopping bags, and saw the children through the glass walls of the reptile room. He smiled at him, and they smiled back. And in that instant, when they smiled, greeted another moment of regret for them. Had they not paused to smile at Monty, but instead gone dashing out to the car, they may have had a brief moment alone with him. But by the time they reached the entry hall, he was already talking to Stefano. "I didn't know what kind of toothbrush you preferred," Uncle Monty was saying apologetically, "so I got you one with extra firm bristles because that's the kind that I like. Peruvian food tends to be sticky, so you need to have at least one extra toothbrush when you go there." "Extra firm bristles are fine with me," Stefano said, speaking to Uncle Monty, but looking at the orphans with his shiny eyes. "Shall I carry in the canoe?" "Yes, but my goodness, you can't carry it yourself," Uncle Monty said. "Klaus, please help Stefano, will you?" "Uncle Monty," Violet said, "we have something very important to tell you." "I'm all ears," Uncle Monty said, "but please first let me show you the wasp repellent I picked up. I'm so glad Klaus read up on the insect situation in Peru, because all the other repellents I have would be of no use at all." Uncle Monty rooted through the bags on his arm as the children waited impatiently for him to finish. "This one contains a chemical called—" "Uncle Monty," Klaus said, "what we have to tell you really can't wait." "Klaus," Uncle Monty said, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "It's not polite to interrupt while your uncle is talking. Now please help Stefano with the canoe, and we'll talk about anything you want in a few moments." Klaus sighed, but followed Stefano out the open door. Violet watched them walking towards the Jeep as Uncle Monty put down his shopping bags and faced her. "Can't remember what I was saying about the repellent," he said a little crossly. "I hate losing my train of thought." "What we have to tell you," Violet began, but she stopped when something caught her eye. Monty was facing away from the door, so he couldn't see what Stefano was doing. But Violet saw Stefano stop at the snake-shaped hedges, reach into his coat pocket, and take out the long knife. Its blade caught the light of the setting sun and glowed brightly, like a lighthouse. As you probably know, lighthouses serve as warning signals, telling ships where the shore is so they don't run into it. The shining knife was a warning, too. Klaus looked at the knife, and then at Stefano, and then at Violet. Violet looked at Klaus, and then Stefano, and then at Monty. Sunny looked at everyone. Only Monty didn't notice what was going on, so intent was he on remembering whatever he was babbling about wasp repellent. "What we have to tell you," Violet began again, but she couldn't continue. Stefano didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Violet knew that if she breathed one word about his true identity, Stefano would hurt her brother right there at the snake-shaped hedges. Without saying a word, the nemesis of the Baudelaire orphans had sent a clear warning. Chapter 5. That night felt like the longest and most terrible that the Baudelaire orphans had ever had, and they had had plenty. There was one night, shortly after Sunny was born, when all three children had a horrible flu and tossed and turned in the grasp of a terrible fever, while their father tried to soothe them all at once, placing cold washcloths on their sweaty brows. The night after their parents had been killed, the three children had stayed at Mr. Poe's house, and had stayed up all night, too miserable and confused to even try to sleep. And of course they had spent many a long and terrible night while living with Count Olaf. But this particular night seemed worse. From the moment of Monty's arrival until bedtime, Stefano kept the children under his constant surveillance. A phrase which here means kept watching them, so they couldn't possibly talk to Uncle Monty alone, and revealed that he was really Count Olaf. And Uncle Monty was too preoccupied to think that anything unusual was going on. When they brought in the rest of Uncle Monty's purchases, Stefano carried the bags only with one hand, keeping the other hand in his coat pocket where the knife was. But Uncle Monty was too excited about all the new supplies to ask about it. When they went into the kitchen to prepare dinner, Stefano smiled menacingly at the children as he sliced mushrooms, but Uncle Monty was too busy making sure the stroganoff sauce didn't boil to even notice that Stefano was using his own threatening knife for the chopping. Over dinner, Stefano told funny stories and praised Monty's scientific work, and Uncle Monty was so flattered that he didn't even think to guess that Stefano was holding a knife under the table, rubbing the blade gently against Violet's knee for the entire meal. And when Uncle Monty announced that he would spend the evening showing his new assistant around the reptile room, he was too eager to realize that the Baudelaires simply went up to bed without a word. For the first time, having individual bedrooms seemed like a hardship rather than a luxury. For without one another's company, the orphans felt even more lonely and helpless. Violet stared at the paper tacked to her walls and tried to imagine what Stefano was planning. Klaus sat in his large cushioned chair and turned on his brass reading lamp, but was too worried to even open a book, and Sunny stared at her hard objects but didn't bite a single one of them. All three children thought of walking down the hall to Uncle Monty's room and waking him up to tell him what was wrong. But to get to his bedroom, they would have to walk past the room in which Stefano was staying, and all night long Stefano kept watch in a chair placed in front of his open door. When the orphans opened their door to peer down the dark hallway, they saw Stefano's pale, shaved head, which seemed to be floating above his body in the darkness. They could see his knife, which Stefano was moving slowly like a pendulum of a grandfather clock. Back and forth it went, back and forth, glinting in the dark, dim light, and the sight was so fearsome that they didn't dare to try walking down the hall. Finally, the house turned to the pale blue-gray color of an early dawn, and the Baudelaire children walked blearily down the stairs to breakfast, tired and achy from their sleepless night. They sat around the table, which they had eaten cake on their first morning at the house, and picked listlessly at their food. For the first time since their arrival at Uncle Monty's, they were not eager to encounter the reptile room and begin the day's work. "I suppose we have to go in now," Violet said, finally putting aside her scarcely nibbled toast. "I'm sure Uncle Monty has already started working and is expecting us. And I'm sure Stefano is in there too," Klaus said, staring glumly into his cereal bowl. "We'll never get a chance to tell Uncle Monty what we know about him." "Yinga," Sunny said sadly, dropping her untouched raw carrot to the floor. "If only Uncle Monty knew what we knew," Violet said, "and Stefano knew that he knew that we know. But Uncle Monty doesn't know what we know, and Stefano knows that he doesn't know what we know." "I know," Klaus said. "I know you know," Violet said, "but what we don't know is what Count Stefano is really up to. He's after our fortune, certainly, but how can he get it if we're under Uncle Monty's care?" "Maybe he's just going to wait till you're of age and then steal the fortune," Klaus said. 4 years is a long time to wait," Violet said. The three orphans were quiet as each remembered where they had been 4 years ago. Violet had been 10 and had worn her hair very short. She remembered that sometime around her 10th birthday, she had invented a new kind of pencil sharpener. Klaus had been about 8, and he remembered how interested he'd been in comets, reading all the astronomy books that his parents had in the library. Sunny, of course, had not been born 4 years ago, and she sat and tried to remember what it was like. Very dark, she thought, with nothing to bite. For all the youngsters, 4 years did seem like a very long time. Come on, you are moving very slowly this morning," Uncle Monty said, bursting into the room. His face seemed even brighter than usual, and he was holding a small bunch of folded papers in one hand. "Stefano has only worked here 1 day, and he's already in the reptile room. In fact, he was up before I was. I ran into him on my way down the stairs. He's an eager beaver. But you three, you're moving like the Hungarian sloth snake, whose top speed is 1/2 inch per hour. We've got lots to do today, and I'd like to catch the 6 o'clock showing of Zombies in the Snow tonight, so let's try to hurry. Violet looked at Uncle Monty and realized that this might be their only opportunity to talk to him alone without Stefano. But he seemed so wound up that they weren't sure if he would listen to them. "Speaking of Stefano," she said timidly, "we'd like to talk to you about him." Uncle Monty's eyes widened, and he looked around him as if there were spiders. "I'd like to just talk to you, too," he said. "I have my suspicions about Stefano, and I'd like to discuss them with you." The Baudelaire orphans looked at one another in relief. "You do?" Klaus said. "Of course," Uncle Monty said. "Last night I began to get very suspicious about this new assistant of mine. There was something a little spooky about him, and Uncle Monty looked around again and began speaking even softer, so the children had to hold their breaths to hear him. "And I think we should discuss outside, shall we?" The children nodded in agreement and rose from the table. leaving their dirty breakfast dishes behind, which is not a good thing to do in general, but perfectly acceptable in the face of an emergency. They walked with Uncle Monty to the front entryway, past the painting of 2 snakes entwined together, and out the front door, onto the lawn, as if they wanted to talk to the snake-shaped hedges instead of one another. I don't mean to be vainglorious, Uncle Monty began, using a word which here means braggy, but I really am one of the most widely respected herpetologists in the world. Klaus blinked. It was an unexpected beginning for the conversation. Of course you are, he said, and because of this, I'm sad to say, Uncle Monty continued, as if he had not heard, many people are very jealous of me. I'm sure that's true, Violet said, puzzled. And when people are jealous, Uncle Monty said, shaking his head, they will do anything. They will do crazy things. When I was getting my herpetology degree, my roommate was so envious of a new toad that I had discovered that he stole and ate my only specimen. I had to do an x-ray on his stomach and use the x-rays rather than the toad in my presentation. And something tells me that we may have a similar situation here. What was Uncle Monty talking about? I'm afraid I don't quite follow you, Klaus said, which is a polite way of saying, what are you talking about, Uncle Monty? Last night after you went to bed, Stefano asked me a few too many questions about snakes and my upcoming expedition. And do you know why? I think so, Violet began, but Uncle Monty interrupted her. It is because this man who is calling himself Stefano is really a member of the Herpetological Society, and he is here to try and find the incredible deadly viper so he can preempt my presentation. Do the 3 of you know what the word preempt means? No, Violet said, but it means that I think that this Stefano is going to steal my snake, Uncle Monty said, and present it to the Herpetological Society. Because it is a new species, there is no way I can prove that I discovered it. Before we know it, the incredibly deadly viper will be called the Stefano snake or something dreadful like that. If he's planning that, just think what he will do to our Peruvian expedition. Each toad we catch, each venom sample we put in a test tube, each snake interview we record, every scrap of work we do will fall into the hands of this Herpetological Society spy. He's not a Herpetological Society spy, Klaus said impatiently. He's Count Olaf. I know just what you mean, Uncle Monty said excitedly. This sort of behavior is indeed as dastardly as that terrible man. That is why I am doing this. He raised one hand and waved the folded papers in the air. As you know, he said, tomorrow we are leaving for Peru. These are our tickets for the 5 o'clock voyage on the Prospero, a fine ship that will take us across the sea to South America. There's a ticket for me, one for Violet, one for Klaus, and one for Stefano, but not one for Sunny, because we are going to hide her in a suitcase to save money. Depot. I'm kidding about that, but I'm not kidding about this, Uncle Monty said, his face flushed with excitement as he took one of the folded papers and began ripping it into tiny pieces. This is Stefano's ticket. He will not be going to Peru with us after all. Tomorrow morning I'm going to tell him that he needs to stay here and look after my specimens instead. That way we can run a successful expedition in peace. But Uncle Monty, Klaus said, how many times must I remind you that it is not polite to interrupt? Uncle Monty interrupted, shaking his head. In any case, I know what you're worried about. You're worried about what will happen if he stays here alone with the incredible deadly viper. Don't worry. The viper will join us in our expeditions, traveling in one of our snake-carrying cases. I don't know why you're looking so glum, Sonny. I thought that you would be happy to have the viper's company. So don't look so worried, Bambini. As you can see, your Uncle Monty has a situation in hand. When somebody is a little bit wrong, say when a waiter puts non-fat milk into your espresso macchiato instead of low-fat milk, it is often quite easy to explain to them how and why they are wrong. But if someone is surpassingly wrong, say when a waiter bites your nose instead of taking your order, you can often be so surprised that you are unable to say anything at all. Paralyzed by how wrong the waiter is, your mouth would hang open slightly, and your eyes would blink over and over, but you would be unable to say a word. This is what the Baudelaire children did. Uncle Monty was so wrong about Stefano in thinking that he was a herpetological spy rather than Count Olaf that the 3 siblings could scarcely think of a way to tell him how. Come now, my dears, Uncle Monty said. We have wasted enough of the morning on talk. We have to... Ow! He interrupted himself with a cry of surprised pain and fell to the ground. Uncle Monty, Klaus cried. The Baudelaire children saw that a large, shiny object was on top of him, and they realized what the object was a moment later. It was the heavy brass reading lamp, the one standing next to the large cushioned chair in Monty's room. Ow! Uncle Monty said, pulling the lamp off him. "That really hurt." "My shoulder must be maybe sprained. It's a good thing it didn't land on my head, or it really could have done some damage." "But where did it come from?" Violet said. "It must have fallen from the window," Uncle Monty said, pointing up to where Klaus's room was. "Whose room is that?" "Klaus, I believe it's yours. You must be more careful. You can't dangle heavy objects out the window like that. Look what almost happened." "But that lamp wasn't anywhere near my window," Klaus said. "I keep it in the alcove so I can read in that large chair." "Really, Klaus," Uncle Monty said, standing up and handing him the lamp. "Do you expect me to believe that that lamp danced over to the window and leapt onto my shoulder? Please put this back in your room in a safe place and we will say no more about it." "But," Klaus said, but his older sister interrupted him. "I'll help you, Klaus," Violet said. "We'll find a place where it's safe." "Well, don't be too long," Uncle Monty said, rubbing his shoulder. "We'll see you in the reptile room. Come on, Sonny." Walking through the entry hall, the four parted their ways at the stairs, with Uncle Monty and Sonny going to the enormous door of the reptile room, and Violet and Klaus carrying the heavy brass lamp up to Klaus's room. "You know very well," Klaus hissed to his sister, "that I was not careless with this lamp." "Of course I know that," Violet whispered, "but there's no use trying to explain that. Uncle Monty, he thinks Stefano is a herpetological spy. You know as well as I do that Stefano was responsible for this." "How clever of you to figure that out," said a voice at the top of the stairs. And Violet and Klaus were so surprised that they almost dropped the lamp. It was Stefano, or if you prefer, it was Count Olaf. It was the bad guy. "But then you've always been clever children," he continued, "a little too clever for my taste. But you won't be around for long, so I'm not troubled by it." "You are not very clever yourself," Klaus said fiercely. "This heavy brass lamp almost hit us, but if anything happened to my sisters or me, you will never get your hands on the Baudelaire fortune." Dear me," Stefano said, his grimy teeth showing as he smiled. "If I want to harm you, orphan, your blood would already be pouring down these stairs like a waterfall. No, I'm not going to harm a hair on any Baudelaire head, not here in this house. You needn't be afraid of me, little ones, until we find ourselves in a location where crimes are more difficult to trace." "And where would that be?" Violet said. "We plan to stay right here until we grow up." "Really?" Stefano said, in that sneaky voice. "Why, I had the impression that we were leaving the country tomorrow." "Uncle Monty tore up your ticket," Klaus replied triumphantly. "He was suspicious of you, so he changed his plans, and now you're not going with us." Stefano's smile seemed to turn into a scowl, and his stained teeth seemed to grow bigger. His eyes grew so shiny that it hurt Violet and Klaus to look at them. "I wouldn't rely on that," he said, in a terrible voice. "Even the best plans can change if there is an accident." He pointed one spiky finger at the brass reading lamp. "And accidents happen all the time." That's where we're going to stop today. I'll give you a little preview of the picture from chapter 6, which is where we'll pick up tomorrow. This is The Reptile Room, the second book in a series of unfortunate events, written by Lemony Snicket with illustrations by Brett Helquist. It's published by Harper Collins Publishers. My name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow to find out what happens next. Bye!